The summertime can often strike many interesting conversations. We're putting together all these lists, wanting to rank various things in the Duke athletics world, and that's certainly the case with Duke basketball. When you look at the top 25 Duke basketball players of the 2010s, is it possible Kyrie Irving isn't even on the list? Who's number one? What goes into making those things? Find out on today's episode of Locked On Blue Devils.
You are Locked On Blue Devils, your daily podcast on the Duke Blue Devils. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everybody, and welcome into another episode of the Locked On Blue Devils podcast. My name is JJ Jackson. It's so great to have you here with us to talk about everything going on in the life of Duke athletics as we do each and every day. Excited to be talking on today's show with one of our new friends, Ben McCormick, the creator of Duke Wisdom. He's got a very interesting list that he has put out that will garner some thoughts as we look at the top 25 basketball player rankings of the 2010s. If you have not done so already, please be sure to follow and subscribe to Locked On Blue Devils for free, wherever it is that you get your podcasts. Make sure that you're watching our show daily on YouTube. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, like this video, share it with your friends. A special shout out to all of our everydayers out there. Thank you for making us your first listen each and every day. As of course, the Locked On Podcast Network is your team every day. So without further ado, really excited to bring him on in. Here is Ben McCormick with us on this fine show today. Ben, I hope everything is going well in your world. I teased it a moment ago, but summertime can kind of create interesting thoughts. And it sounds like this is what happened for you as you start to put together these ranking lists of Duke players by decades. How did you get here?
Yeah, man. Well, thanks for having me on, JJ. Basically, every summer I end up getting into this mode, and especially so back when, it was still college days where I didn't have a whole lot to do. And so it was just like I'm constantly thinking about ranking and evaluating basketball players in some sort of way, and Duke's my wheelhouse. So I've always wanted to do a top 100 players list. So I started breaking it down by decade, like who's the best players from which decade. And so the 2010s list is kind of unique because there's just so much talent in that decade because of the one and done era and everything. But I just sat down, I wrote out the list, and I did a little bit of polling on Twitter to kind of gauge where everybody was at, to see if I was out in left field on some of them. But that's pretty much how it came together.
When you do something like this, are you starting 1 to 25? Like how do you put this all together?
Yeah, I think that I started I created a list with guys who had averaged double digits at some point from 2010 to 2019. And then that pretty much, they had to hit that bar to even be considered. And then from there, I was sort of like, I put them into tiers. I had like tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, tier 4. And then amongst those tiers, I would rank them. And that made it easier. And I kind of started from top down, I think.
You've got a podcast out there, the Duke Wisdom podcast, where you go through every single selection that you've got for the top 25. And it's really interesting to listen to you describe your thought process, Ben, in putting these things together. Did you find yourselves debating more of like the 16 to 25 range, who should go where, or was it the top half of the field that you felt the most curiosity and not sure how it would shape up?
Man, I think that the very top wasn't terribly difficult, I don't think. I mean, there's a little bit of, I think the middle's where it really starts getting dicey. I think once RJ Barrett's ranked 7th. And I think once you get past RJ Barrett from like that 8 to 17, 18, 19 range, somewhere in there, there's so many clusters of 3 or 4 guys that I could have reordered in any way and felt okay with it at the very least. So it was really difficult in that middle section.
I'll bury the lead. Zion's number 1 on the list, and I don't think that you're going to have much argument there. He comes in the back half of the decade there in 2019 with just 1 season, and that is something that you had to weigh out as well, right? Is because some of these guys that made the list played more than just 1 season at Duke. A couple played a handful, and then there were some one-and-done guys. What was it about that year for Zion in 2019 that you're like, you know what, this is worthy? He deserves to be there at the top by himself.
Well, I mean, you mentioned it. Like, how do you weigh Kyle Singler and Nolan Smith's 4-year accomplishments that puts them in the top 10 in so many statistical categories. They're countless team awards and accolades and stuff that they racked up. But for me, because Zion had National Player of the Year, that put him in kind of a different stratosphere, first of all.
Sure.
And then second of all, I think there's just the eye test, man. Like, I think there are other players that the eye test would suggest they're better than Kyle Singler on this list, that are lower than Kyle Singler. But for me, Zion was so high on that eye test that no one else could possibly have touched him. He was just such a ridiculous talent. I've never seen anything like him. I don't think we'll ever see anything like him again. He was just that incredible. And then that National Player of the Year award is what made me feel a little bit better about it.
But Ben, you mentioned the eye test, and then you've also, to your point, got to balance, okay, what do we weigh from the time that they had at Duke versus the players that they are? I teased it right at the top of the show. Is it possible that Kyrie Irving does not make a top 25 Duke basketball players list of the 2010s? And you proved that it is. I mean, you look at Kyrie's lone season, how difficult of a decision is that? I think it's justified, but to your point that you were making on the podcast, yeah, I mean, he just didn't play very many games for Duke.
It's difficult to make that decision because there's a lot of people I know that when you say, who's your all-time Duke starting five, Kyrie's on it. And I've always kind of taken a step back because I'm like, what form of Kyrie? Honestly, in the 11 games he played at Duke, the level of play he had was in line with, I don't know, 10th on this list at least.
Really damn good, yeah.
He was very good. He was very, very good. However, 11 games, man, I don't know, because then if I'm giving him an in for 11 games, I think I got to start considering Jalen Johnson for 11 games at that point. And it's like, do I really feel like doing that? Not really. I don't know. I mean, he was a very good player, but I think you had to have an impact, and his impact was very measured because of the amount of games he played.
It's certainly an interesting conversation, and you're right. Anytime you make your top five Duke basketball players, or we're building a starting five, or we're looking at the favorites, look, we're going to claim Kyrie Irving every single day of the week and twice on Sunday, as we should. But it is wild because there's not a very large sample size of the time that he spent on the Duke roster. All right, it's the top 25 Duke basketball players of the 2010s. We're going to give you a little more history on Duke wisdom. We will do that after we take our first time out here on this episode of Locked On Blue Devils. Locked On Blue Devils here today is brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel. We know that this time of year there aren't as many sports available. Obviously, the playoffs have come and gone for both the NBA and the NHL. We're stuck with a whole lot of baseball right now, but that's fine because right now FanDuel has the best odds for baseball. FanDuel's hooking up all customers with a boost or bonus daily. Every time you log in, there's something for everyone every day all summer long. So go ahead and head over to FanDuel.com and start making the most out of your summer. The trade deadline is fast approaching. We've got futures odds for these division races in baseball. Go check it all out over at FanDuel. FanDuel is an official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball and a proud sponsor of the Locked On Blue Devils podcast. Let's keep rolling. Here we are. It's JJ Jackson. I'm joined today by Ben McCormick, the creator of Duke Wisdom. He put out there into the world the top 25 hoopers of the 2010s. You got a full decade to work with here. Towards the top of the list, people will find the likes of Nolan Smith and Kyle Singler, two integral parts of that 2010 national championship team. As you started to put together these lists, as you've discussed, the 2000s, the 2020s, the 1990s, everybody kind of wants to know, well, what about guys that are there at the turn of the decade? How did you settle on that, Ben?
The turn of the decade, it's whoever they played the majority of that decade in. So I guess there could be a guy where it's like they played in 2009, 10, and 11. That would easily put them in the 2010s because they played more than half their career. But if it's a direct split like Kyle and Nolan were, it's when were they the best? When did they have their most impact? And that was clearly in the back half of their careers, so the 2010s.
Probably makes sense. I don't know that we're going to come across too many people that had the best, freshman and sophomore year and then fell off their junior and senior year if that were to be the case. But again, really interesting to kind of put this list together as we look at the top 25 Duke basketball players of the 2010s. A lot of outside shooting in this list, a lot of one-and-done players. Tell me just a little bit more about the thought process in terms of when you looked at somebody like Andre Dawkins or Matt Jones and kind of what they were able to do.
Yeah, so there were so many players that I considered for this. Like I'm in the process of looking at the 2000s and the 90s, and it would be a real stretch for me to go out to 25 players, like a legitimate large stretch. Whoever I'm putting at 25 in the 90s, Andre Dawkins and Matt Jones are clearing them. I can tell you that. But all the one and dones made it so difficult because so many of those one and dones, I think, were just better players on face value than Matt Jones and Andre Dawkins were, who were at the very end of this list. But to me, it was like, you look at the 4-year effort of players like that to be a 1,000-point scorer like Andre Dawkins. That was a big deal. That's a big deal. That doesn't happen a lot in the 2010s anymore. So when a player crosses that 1,000-point threshold, that was pretty much an automatic in my eyes. Like if you passed 1,000, you were on this list. So that got Dawkins in. For Matt Jones, individual accolades had to be there in some sort of way. And I think the all-defensive selection that Matt Jones had. So looking at awards for guys like that, when I'm thinking about the fact that did I really believe Matt was better than like some one and done I left off the list, I don't know, honestly. But I think he had a better career and he had more impact.
Well, both of those guys that we just named have national championship rings on their fingers. So that helps, right? I mean, when you sit here and you think about the best players from Duke, we think about those 5 championship teams first. You think about the players within that team. And then, of course, you've got the Zions that come along, the Jason Tatums, the J.J. Redicks, those all-time greats that somehow walked out of Durham without a national championship ring. So with the 2020s, over at your website, you've already started to work and you've put out there the top 15. Again, we're still in the heart of this decade, so a little bit difficult for you to go all the way to 25. Just a short sample size. Was that easier than 25 of the 2010s, or because it was so few years, does it become more difficult to do that?
Harder. I think it's hard. It was more difficult because we haven't been able to take a step back on a lot of these guys and really see what they're accomplishing, especially the guys that are currently on the team or just finished their season. It's like with Tyrese Proctor, I have Tyrese Proctor 10 on that list. And I don't know. It's weird and it's hard because I don't know if either of his seasons were individually better than AJ Griffin, honestly, but he's got 2 of them. So that's kind of how I measured it. And it's like, well, then he's a little higher. And also the 2020s so far for Duke, we haven't seen a lot of super dominant players. And we haven't seen guys that have super dominant 4-year runs. There's no Nolan Smiths. There's no Kyle Singlers. So far, there's no Zion Williamson. There might be one this year. But there's not been a Zion Williamson. There hasn't even been an RJ Barrett. Paulo Banchero is really, really good. He's really good. But I would liken him to Jabari Parker. And Jabari Parker ended up, at the tail end of the top 10 in the 2010s. So it's kind of interesting, the differences there.
Yeah, I'm certainly excited to see Cooper Flagg play basketball for the Blue Devils this year because you're right, there is kind of a Zion level of buzz. Let's talk a little current Duke basketball before we take our final timeout because you mentioned Tyrese Proctor, who's already on the list. What does this next year look like for Proctor, a guy that has been kind of up and down throughout the course of his career? He's got Adrian Wojnarowski a year ago breaking the news that he's returning to college, labeling him as a projected lottery pick in the 2024 draft. That clearly didn't happen. Now he's coming back for another season. He's got an opportunity to continue to climb kind of this decade's watch with the type of player he is. What does this next year look like for him, do you think?
Well, I think, in terms of the list, just first of all, I think that Tyrese could end up as number 6, number 5 on this list this time next year. But I've maintained that Tyrese Proctor's career has seemed to mirror Wendell Moore's in a lot of ways. And you look at a guy that's a talented 5-star player coming in. He's a starter as a freshman, but he's not. But there's a lot of holes in his game. Like there's clearly NBA upside there, but he's not ready for it. Comes back to very lofty expectations. I don't know if a lot of people might not be familiar with the fact that Wendell Moore was expected to be at least the second best player on the team for a 2 or 3 seed. in 2021. He fell drastically short of those expectations as a sophomore. I don't even think Tyrese fell quite as short as Wendell did as a sophomore, but he certainly didn't live up to the All-American lottery pick hype that we had for him last offseason. I don't think that Tyrese Proctor is a scorer first. Neither was Wendell Moore. They're two players that don't shoot a lot, honestly. They take their looks when they can get them. But they're still clearly NBA talents. Clearly an NBA talent. Do I think Tyrese Proctor will be a lottery pick in 2025? No. Do I think he will be a first-round pick? Yes. And that's kind of how Wendell Moore panned out. He was able to play a big role for a good Final Four team and cement himself as a first-round pick. I see Tyrese going pretty similarly.
Yeah, I can't wait to see what this next year looks like for him. I think the sky's the limit, certainly, and hopefully getting some playmakers around him once again this season. Injuries kind of popped up throughout the course of his sophomore season. Anytime you could stay clear of those, that's certainly going to be big. All right, let's go ahead and we'll take one more timeout here on the show. And then when we come back, we got to start to wrap things up. I want to hear a little bit more about Duke Wisdom and go and support the work that Ben's got going on. We're back in just a moment. All right, Locked On Blue Devils here today, brought to you by our friends at eBay Motors. We love them. Passion, drive, and patience. It's the formula for winning championships. And friends, it's also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything that you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And friends, with the eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time, or you get your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit is only available to U.S. customers. All right, let's get going. We'll start to wrap things up here today. JJ Jackson, again, joined by Ben McCormick, the Duke Wisdom creator. What in the world is Duke Wisdom, Ben?
Duke Wisdom started as an 11-year-old's Instagram page.
How about that?
A pure fan page for a kid that had just started middle school, just discovered Instagram at that. Wanted to create some sort of outlet for his Duke basketball love that wasn't his personal account because his friends were getting tired of it. So, yeah, that's what it started as.
And you're that kid. You're that 11-year-old
that kid
who started it. Obviously not 11 now. Life has taken you down very different paths here, and all of a sudden you find yourself putting stories behind that. I mean, talk about the development. Now there's a podcast, the stories. What does that look like? How do you go from an 11-year-old Instagram account to where you stand today?
So basically it remained me just posting like game stuff for a while. And then I created this website through Wix in middle school, actually, sometime around 2015, probably.
Yeah.
And I started trying to write a little bit, doing that kind of thing. And I kept going with the Instagram. I started at Duke_recruiting on Twitter, which was kind of a subsect, and it's been turned into the official Duke Wisdom Twitter page since. But I kept going with the Instagram. I went with the website for about 2 years and then lost it in 2017 when I started high school. I kept going with the Instagram and the Twitter, and I built a little bit of a following. And then about midway through college, I decided to reboot the website, redo the website, start writing and publishing articles consistently, because by this point I'm actually a practicing writer. So I'm thinking I'm honestly qualified to do this now. And so I put that out there. And then I think last summer I'm thinking, how else can I grow this thing? You know, I'm 21 years old at that point, and I'm like, I think that I'm in a position now, and I have the skill set now where I can turn this thing that was just a passion project as a kid into something a lot bigger. And so I start the podcast, and I start the Duke Wisdom Network, where I had people joining in and writing articles as well that are published on the website. And I act as editor for that. And everything else has blown up, and it's been a very rewarding experience, really.
Well, Ben, here we are. We're talking about the best 25 hoopers of decades and lists that we're doing over the course of decades. You've had Duke Wisdom now for over a decade.
Crazy.
You mentioned going back to your 11-year-old self. Is that when you came up with the Duke Wisdom name, like the name itself? Is there an origin story, or this was just something that popped in your head on a particular day and it stuck?
It's crazy to me. I don't know. I think everybody had always told me that I was just some sort of basketball savant, some sort of like mind that I was just a kid that always thought about it, and I was so smart about it and that kind of thing. And so I was like, well, I don't know. Wisdom just kind of struck me. And so I came up with Duke Wisdom. I don't remember the exact day or anything. I was probably like 10 or something when I came up with the name for that. And then it just ended up being what I used. And then it's evolved kind of that imagery of wisdom has gotten into the logos and everything that I've used, which my brother actually designed. He's a graphic designer. So it's
awesome.
It's gone through, and I've never changed it. I've lived by that name.
That's so terrific. Duke_Wisdom on X. You're also on X as well. Ben MCC33. All right. If you go to your profile, if you start to do just a little bit of your homework with Ben McCormick, the last thing we got to talk about, it appears you're a UNC alum, my friend.
Yeah,
how does this happen? Tell this story.
Yeah, well, so it turns out that sometimes you don't end up going to the school that you root for growing up.
Amen to that.
For me, I wanted to be a journalist. That was always in the back of my mind, but I also wanted to go into politics, and I wanted to go somewhere that was affordable. I applied to about 6 schools. I got into most of them, but UNC to me, I made my college decision during COVID. So there were a couple schools I wasn't able to actually go visit or anything. And I full front, I don't think I've ever said this on my podcast or anything. I fully intended to go to Davidson. Like, that was where I thought I was going to end up going to college. And I went to sleep April 30th. I had to pay the deposit May 1st. And I woke up that morning and I thought, my friends are going to Carolina. My brother goes to Carolina. It's the closest school to my home, and we're in the middle of a pandemic. And it's good at both of the things I want to do in life. And I just had to make the life decision. It hurt. It hurt a little bit. I won't lie, but I made the life decision, and I think it was the right one.
Yeah, I mean, look at you now. Clearly, the right decision pays off. I'm so curious in this because we hear about the rivalry so much. We hear about, I go all the way back to Gerald Henderson and Wayne Ellington being high school teammates, and now they star on opposite teams in college basketball's finest rivalry. Are you out and proud as this Duke basketball guy walking around campus every single day? What does your life look like?
No, man. No, there's one football game my sophomore year that I wore a Duke jersey to. And honestly, I'm glad that we lost that game by like 37 because I probably would have got beat up otherwise. But I was not, no one knew unless you really knew me. Like, I didn't wear Carolina ever, but I also never wore anything else college related. I wore mostly like Milwaukee Bucks t-shirts. If I was wearing a sports thing, it was professional. And so no one knew outside of my closest friends and the people I worked with at the Daily Tar Heel. Actually, they knew. But I had to remain objective for that job anyway, So it was fine, I guess.
That's so incredible. I love it. That's such a cool story. And obviously, go check out Duke Wisdom. I've promoted a good bit of your work. What else would you like to share with people? How can they best support you, Ben?
Yeah, man. Just look up the Duke Wisdom podcast wherever you're listening to it. Make sure you listen in, especially once the season really starts. Once we get into October, I'll be more regular releases, that kind of thing. So make sure to listen in there. Go to dukewisdom.org, read what I've got going on. So just, I guess, check that out. And if you want to work with me and some of the other guys, we have a Slack channel that goes on for the Duke Wisdom Network. I mentioned it earlier. You can find the link to join that on the website as well. So that would be great if you want to get involved.
Yeah, go check it all out. Support Ben and what he's got going on. And who knows, maybe there are more of these top 25 lists coming our way. And then we got more decades to look at. So
there will be more decades soon. I've just started a new job, so life's busy, but I'm getting there. Ben,
thank you so much for taking time to join us on the podcast today. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, man. Thank you for having me.
All right, that's Ben McCormick joining us on the show today. And that wraps up our conversation and our podcast for this one. Please go check out dukewisdom.org for all the great work that Ben's got going on over there. That'll do it for our show here today. As always, go Duke. I'll talk to you tomorrow. My name is JJ Jackson. Thank you and good day.